Will Lai Tieu Circus ex-husband face justice for kidnapping Tieu Han? The late afternoon sun spilled golden light across the mountain valley, casting long shadows across the palm leaf roof of a quiet countryside home. Birds chirped lazily. The breeze was gentle. Everything looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. Behind the house, Lai Tieu knelt in the dirt, tossing kernels of corn to the chickens. Their eager clucks filled the air as they pecked at the ground. Just a few steps away in the yard, her little girl, Tieu Han, was playing joyfully with a swarm of butterflies, her laughter as bright as wind chimes. For a fleeting moment, everything felt safe. Then, the laughter stopped. Her legs buckled, her voice cracked. "Where are you, my baby?" Terror surged through her like a wildfire. She ran behind trees, checked under the porch, screamed until her throat burned, but her daughter was gone. And then the name struck her like a knife. Her ex? The man who once said he loved her, but chose drugs, violence, and darkness instead. The same man who tried to extort money from her using their newborn child. He had been arrested, yes, but released far too easily, shuffled from prison to rehab, and back into the world like a ticking time bomb. Now, that bomb had exploded in her life again. He had taken Han. Hung. She sobbed into the phone, her voice breaking. He took Han. I don't know where she is. I think it was Can. Hung's voice came like a lifeline, calm, steady, urgent. Tieu Ko, listen to me. I'm coming right now. We'll get her back. Within minutes, Hung had notified the police and was speeding down the winding mountain roads. When he arrived, he found her curled on the floor, pale and breathless, her eyes swollen with tears. He helped her up, his voice low and firm. We're going to get Han. I think I know where he took her. They drove without speaking. Every second felt like a lifetime. Finally, they pulled up in front of Can's mother's house, the place Han used to visit before her father disappeared into drugs and chaos. The moment Lai Tieu stepped out of the car, her heart skipped. She heard it. A child's voice. Han? She burst into the yard and saw her daughter sitting on the ground, clutching a worn-out toy. Relief crashed over her, followed immediately by fury. Can was sitting across from Han, eyes sunken, posture slouched. His mother stood behind him, arms crossed, lips pursed. Can, Tieu Ko screamed. How dare you take her? Without a word. Without permission. Can stood up, defiant. She's my daughter. I have every right. Every right. She barked back. You disappeared for years. You were in prison, rehab, sleeping around, using drugs while I stayed and raised her alone. Don't you dare talk about rights. His mother cut in coldly. She's our blood. And just because some rich man is helping you now, doesn't mean she's not still his child. Hung stepped forward. His voice was quiet, but it struck like thunder. Taking a child without the mother's consent is kidnapping, and the police are already on their way. Can's smirk vanished. Minutes later, flashing lights appeared down the road. 2 officers stepped out, asked questions, listened, and finally turned to Can. You're under arrest for violating custody laws and abducting a minor. This is a mistake. Can protested, but it was too late. As he was led away in handcuffs, his mother shouted, You'll regret this, Tieu Ko. But she didn't flinch. She held Han tighter. This time, she would not be afraid. Will can face justice. The battle wasn't over. The legal system was slow and flawed. There would be hearings, arguments, attempts to twist the truth. But this time, Lai Tayuka was ready. She had evidence. She had witnesses. She had the police on her side. And more than anything, she had Hung, who stood by her like a rock, refusing to let fear control their lives again. Justice may take time. But Lai Tayuka was no longer the woman who cried in silence. She was the mother who fought with everything she had. And this time, she would win. Across the room, Hung stood by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the mountains. He had barely spoken since they got back. He didn't have to. His quiet presence said everything. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I don't know how I'm going to get through this, Lai Tayuka whispered, breaking the silence. Hung turned, walked over, and sat on the floor beside her. One day at a time, he said. We're going to do this together. Weeks later, the courtroom. The courthouse was cold, sterile. A place of rules and echoes. Tu Ku sat on the wooden bench, holding her breath as her name was called. Kan sat across the room, wearing a suit that didn't hide his twitching fingers or hollowed eyes. He looked thinner, nervous. His mother sat behind him, stiff and proud, pretending nothing was wrong. The judge glanced over the files, then looked up. We're here to determine whether Mr. Ken is fit for shared custody or visitation of the minor child, Tayuhan. Lai Tayuka's hands tightened on her lap. Her lawyer stood and calmly listed every fact. Kan's drug addiction history, prior arrests, a lack of involvement in Han's life since birth, the kidnapping incident, the trauma inflicted on the child. Then came Hung. He stood as a character witness, strong, steady. His words rang clear in the courtroom. I've watched Lai Tayuka raise Han with love and care. She is the most devoted mother I have ever seen. She hasn't had an easy life, but she has given her daughter peace, stability, and joy, things no child should live without. Ken doesn't deserve another chance, not when he's never made an effort to earn one. When Kan spoke, his voice was shaky. He tried to appear remorseful. I just wanted to see my daughter, he said. I made mistakes, yes, but I'm her father. But when the judge asked him basic questions about Han, her favorite food, her school, her medical history, he couldn't answer any of them. That silence spoke louder than any lie he tried to tell. The verdict. The judge's voice was calm but firm. Mr. Kan, you are found unfit for visitation or custody. You are to maintain a distance of no less than 500 meters from Tayuhan and her mother. Any future violations will result in further legal action. Lai Tayuhan exhaled for the first time in weeks. Kan's mother protested. Kan shouted. But none of it mattered anymore. Because justice finally had spoken. After the storm. Outside the courthouse, the clouds broke and the sun emerged. Lai Tayuka stood beside Hung, holding Han's small hand as they stepped into the sunlight. Han didn't understand everything that had happened, but she looked up at her mother and smiled. Are we safe now, Mommy? Tayuka bent down and kissed her forehead. Yes, baby, we're safe. Hung placed a gentle hand on her back. Come on, Let's go home. Home, a word that used to mean fear and loneliness, now filled with laughter, warm meals, tiny footsteps, and the promise of peace. Lai Tayuka glanced at Hung. Thank you for everything. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You don't have to thank me. You and Han are my family now. She felt something stirred deep in her chest, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in years. Hope. A lesson in courage, love, and standing up for what matters. Sometimes, the people who appear the quietest carry the loudest strength within. The story of Lai Tayuka taught me that true courage isn't always about grand gestures or powerful speeches. Sometimes, it's about trembling hands that still hold on, about tired eyes that never stop searching, and about a heart that refuses to give up, even when it's shattered. What moved me most was not just her fear, but her resilience, the way she called for help, leaned on those who loved her like Hung, and stood tall in court to make her voice heard, even when it trembled. She didn't try to be perfect. She just tried to be present. And that, I realized, is what real love looks like. Being there even when it hurts. From this story, I learned that love is protection. It doesn't have to be loud to be real. Sometimes, love is found in the quiet moments. The steady presence, the arms that stay wrapped around you when everything else feels like it's falling away. A mother's love is a force greater than fear, addiction, or abandonment. Tiohe didn't have power in the traditional sense, but she had purpose. And that gave her the strength to protect her daughter, no matter the cost. After the storm passed, Lai Toi didn't go back to being the woman she once was. She became someone stronger, wiser, and softer in ways that only those who've faced deep pain truly understand. She still woke up sometimes in the middle of the night, checking to make sure Han was still beside her. She still held her breath when she heard footsteps near the gate. It also made me reflect on what kind of love really matters in this life. Not the love that promises flowers but disappears during storms, but the love that shows up when your world falls apart and quietly helps you pick up the pieces.